Well, I want you to think about the most recent movie you've watched, or maybe your current favorite television show on TV or on Netflix. And think about, what is it about that movie or show that you like so much? What is it that's captured your attention? What is it that you've found enjoyable or entertaining as you've watched that movie or that film? You got it in mind? How has that story impacted and influenced you? How has it shaped your thinking, your understanding of the world around us, of who we are in this world? You see, movies and stories and shows have a tremendous impact and influence on us. In fact, some movies that predated my lifetime and during my early lifetime they've done some studies on those to see what kind of impact those films had. So Jaws was released in 1975, and interestingly, many shark species were nearly driven to extinction following the release of that film. People were literally afraid to go to the beach and get in the water. That was actually one of the taglines of the film, because it was so gripping and so realistic, at least in 1975's movie standards, that people were terrified of sharks and saw them as this public enemy number one. Similarly, when The Karate Kid came out in 1984, I was 2 years old, a number of kids started taking martial arts classes. It just exploded on the scene, especially in the United States, where martial arts wasn't all that common or popular. Following that film, every little kid wanted to learn martial arts. And similarly, in 1986, when Top Gun was released, military recruitment skyrocketed. Everyone wanted to be a fighter pilot. Everyone wanted to play volleyball on the beach and look cool. It's films like these that have a cultural impact and influence on us. And the reason for that is that stories have power. They have power to do many things. Stories are more than just mere entertainment. They actually have the ability to attract our attention. Particularly in the culture that we live in, we're looking for something to grab our attention and to grab a hold of us, and to really consider these big questions of who we are and what the world is like. Stories also have the power to spark our imagination. They take us into worlds that we don't get to live in, to be characters that are different than who we are. And so it allows us to kind of put reality on hold and see a different reality for a moment. It also provides a context, a sense of where are we in this story, and helps us to remember. So we often remember things that are connected to stories more than we do just mere information. Stories also build a sense of community. We talk about the stories that we've heard or that we've seen, and we build community around them. There's people that we connect to that have seen the same stories or into the same stories, and that builds a sense of community and understanding. And lastly, stories have the power to create and challenge our worldviews, the way that we see and understand the world that we live in. And so stories shape that and cause us to ask questions about the world that we live in. We currently are a culture saturated with stories, and all of those stories are competing for our time and attention because they want to shape what we believe about what is true, what is right, and what is good. So we have to be mindful of what stories are we allowing to shape and influence us. What stories are we taking in and considering, because they are attempting to convey a message. They are more than mere entertainment. The reality is, as Paul Tripp says, we are meaning makers. He says it this way: we do not live our lives based on the bare facts of our existence. We live our lives according to our interpretation of those facts. And the stories we tell and the stories we believe are often indications of how we have interpreted the facts of our existence. As we take stories in, we have to make sense of them. We have to interpret them. What does this mean? What does this mean about who I am? What does this mean about the world that I live in? For the people of Israel, God's chosen people, the Exodus story was the defining story. It was the story that they would have pointed to understand who they were as God's people, what made them distinct and separate from the rest of the world. Now, through Jesus, we have also become God's chosen people. So the Exodus story is now our story as well. We are grafted into that story. It has been passed down for generations because it helps us understand who God is, what God has done, who we are, and how we are to live. But the Exodus story is just a main chapter or scene in a much larger and greater story, really God's meta story for all of creation. So we want to take a little bit of time before we get into the Exodus story and kind of zoom out and look at the 30,000-foot view of the story that God is telling. God's story begins in creation, where we see in Genesis 1 and 2, God creating all things. God is the first actor in this story. He steps onto the stage and he makes everything into existence. But that also includes God making man and woman in his image. So in this creation story, we learn, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be human, created in God's image? Well, the first thing it means is that we are created by God. We are created, we are not the creator. Additionally, it means that we are created in the image of God, the imago Dei. We are made in his image. We are like him. We reflect him. We're also made before the face of God, coram Deo, meaning we live all of life in front of God. He sees everything. He sees all of our existence. And there's an interesting part at the end of chapter 2 when Adam and Eve are placed in the garden. It says that they are naked and unashamed. That even though they are before one another and before God, they are naked, they're completely vulnerable, and yet they are unashamed. They're not fearful, they're not timid, they're not hesitant, they're free. They're at peace with God and with one another. And their nakedness is a symbol of that, the complete vulnerability that they experience. They're not worried about what the other is going to do, or how they might be taken advantage of or harmed. They're naked and unashamed. And they're created in order to worship God. Their purpose is to glorify God, to make much of him as the creator of all things. That's what they were created for. And they're longing for peace and harmony and wholeness with God, which comes from God. God establishes shalom in his creation. Things are the way they're supposed to be. They're rightly ordered. And it's that part of the story that is really hard for us to imagine and to believe. That at one point in creation, that's how things were. Things were the way they were supposed to be. And we look around us, and all we need to do is watch the news for 5 minutes, and we can see things are not the way they're supposed to be. Things are not the way they're supposed to be. So the story continues in Genesis 3. It moves quickly, and it gives us an understanding of what went wrong in God's creation. What went wrong in God's creation? What we see is Adam and Eve are given dominion over his creation. They're given a mandate to be fruitful and multiply. And there's one stipulation. There's one tree in the garden that they're not to eat from. And of course, that's all they can think about is eating of that tree. And so what goes wrong is their choice to disobey God and to rebel against him. Ultimately, they believe the lies of the serpent over God's truth. And that destroys everything. That damages everything that God has created. This leads to a distortion between the distinction between creator and created. We try to become God, not be content with being like God as he created us, but we want to replace him. We want to live as if he doesn't exist and isn't necessary. We want to become God. It also corrupts. We are no longer image bearers that reflect accurately what God is like. It erodes our awareness of life lived before the face of God. There are so many people in this world today who don't have any regard for God. No awareness, no understanding, and certainly no belief that God exists. And rather than being naked and unashamed, we've become fearful and ashamed. I'm amazed at how often, as I talk to people and consider my own life, how fear is such a driving force. We live in constant fear, and I think that fear is often because of the shame we feel. We recognize that we are not the way we're supposed to be, and neither are the things around us. Our tendency then is to worship anything and everything other than God, which is what the Bible refers to as idolatry. Idolatry is simply looking to something other than God to give us the things that only God can, putting our trust and hope and faith in anything other than God. That's going to be a very big theme in the Exodus story as we see it unfold. And what this leads to is shalom is spoiled. Instead of peace and harmony and wholeness, we have conflict, division, and abuse. We live in this constant state of broken shalom. And each of us, even those who are non-Christians, would say that they are longing for things to be different, that longing for things to be better, longing for things to be as they should be. The trouble is we all have a different idea on how to get there. So what's the solution to this problem? What do we do about this brokenness in our world and in ourselves? Well, God's plan is a plan for salvation. Rather than merely fixing things, He is going to save us from this brokenness. And the way He's going to save us is He's going to send His own Son on a rescue mission. So what He tells Adam and Eve is that through their offspring there will come a Savior who will defeat Satan, who will defeat sin, and who will defeat death, our greatest enemies. And this offspring, we learn, as we know, will be God's own Son, who will come on a rescue mission to pay the penalty for our sin, because there is a penalty for our disobedience and our rebellion. But He's also going to bring God's rule and reign on earth as it is in heaven. That's the plan for restoration, how things will be returned to the way they're supposed to be. Now, we live in this time of already but not yet. Jesus has already come. He's already inaugurated the coming of His kingdom. He's already lived His life and died on the cross in order to forgive us of sin. He's resurrected to new life, and yet we have not fully experienced all of God's restoration. But God gives us a hint of how the story will end. It's as if we're reading a book and we just can't wait, so we flip to the very last page to see how the story ends. And that's what we get in the biblical story is we can read of what's going to happen in the end. And this is God's picture of restoration. How will the story end? God tells us that He will make all things new. In Revelation 21:5, He's going to make all things new. Not just fix what was broken, He's going to make things new. Not just put together the pieces like Humpty Dumpty all over again. He's going to make something altogether new. We're going to have new bodies. We're going to have new, renewed relationships with God and with one another. Everything that is wrong will be made new. Imagine that. Imagine what that will be like to spend eternity in a restored creation where all things are as they're supposed to be. No more sickness, no more sadness, no more death, no more temptation to sin, and no more suffering. And that's a longing that we all have because we understand what it means to suffer. And that's the experience of the Israelites as well. As we will see, their story is one of tremendous suffering. And so they're longing for things to be the way they're supposed to be. Well, as the Old Testament unfolds, we see God's story unfold as well, and how His plan for redemption will come to fruition. God calls Abram, who becomes Abraham, so He chooses a family to be His means of grace and redemption to the world. Abraham has a son named Isaac, and then Isaac has a son named Jacob. Jacob has many sons, but he has a favorite son, one of the youngest, Joseph. And Joseph's story is important to us because it sets the scene for the Exodus story. We have to understand Joseph's story so we can understand what's happening in Exodus. Joseph's story is important because it gives us understanding as to why are God's people in slavery at the start of the Exodus story. What went wrong for them to wind up in slavery? Well, Genesis 37 as well as 39 through 50 tell Joseph's story. It's as if the story slows down and zooms in on this one particular family. We see that Jacob spoils Joseph. He gives him a robe of many colors, and Joseph's brothers are understandably jealous of him. Joseph also has the gift of interpreting dreams, and he foolishly tells his brothers, hey, guess what? One day you're going to all bow down to me. They didn't take that very well. I can imagine my youngest brother saying that to me. I don't think I would take that very lightly. So they become jealous, and they come up with this great plan. Let's sell Joseph into slavery. That'll solve all of our problems. Problem is, obviously, their father, Jacob, is deeply saddened by this. So Joseph is betrayed by his brothers. He winds up in Egypt, and initially he finds favor and success. He's actually very successful. He's a good business person. He is very organized. He has many administrative gifts. He's very competent and qualified. But then eventually he's actually falsely accused of making sexual advancements towards his master's wife. And that winds him up in jail, and he's essentially left for dead. But there's a Pharaoh that's having all these bad dreams, and he doesn't know how to interpret the dreams, and someone gets word that Joseph knows how to interpret dreams. So he actually interprets Pharaoh's dreams and tells him there's a famine coming, and you need to prepare. There's 7 years that are going to be plentiful, and you need to use those to store up food, because after that is coming a devastating famine. And so Pharaoh essentially makes Joseph his right-hand man. He's given favor once again, and he is successful, and those dreams come true. And so Egypt is kind of this place where the famine is not touched as severely as the surrounding lands. They're actually able to get through the famine relatively unscathed. But back in Canaan, where Joseph's family is, they're experiencing the harsh reality of that famine. So they go to Egypt looking for food, and they wind up finding their long-lost brother. He kind of conceals himself, and they don't really know who he is, and then he reveals himself and says, it's me, the brother that you betrayed. And of course, they are terrified, because now he's in a position of power, and they're worried about what he's going to do. But Joseph, because of God's grace to him, gives grace to his brothers. And the way that Genesis ends is Joseph saying to his brothers, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones. What you meant for evil, God meant for good. This is more than God simply using their evil. It's not just twisting the evil and bending it over on itself to bring about good. God meant this. It means he intended this for good. And so Joseph is rightly understanding his suffering. He's not crying out to God in anger, why did you allow this to happen? He's given the perspective, which God doesn't always give, to help Joseph see this is what I intended from the beginning, that your suffering would lead to the salvation of many. So in this way, Joseph serves as kind of a prefigure of Christ, someone who will suffer so that many can be saved. So that begins to help us understand this idea of suffering. Why do we suffer? Well, there are times where we suffer for the good of others, and often for our own good as well. So that brings us to the Israelites' story at the beginning of Exodus 1, where we've now kind of set the scene. 400 some years have passed, and God's people are in slavery in Egypt. So we read in Exodus 1, verse 1, these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. So this little ragtag bunch of Israelites winds up in Egypt, and they kind of camp out there. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel, these 70 people or so, were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now, this language of fruitful and multiplied is an echo of Genesis. God's cultural mandate to Adam and Eve, that they were to be fruitful and multiply. And that's what God tells Abram. You're going to be a great nation. I'm going to make you a great nation. The interesting thing about Abraham and Sarah's story is they were infertile. They were barren. They couldn't have kids, or at least they didn't think they could. And God chooses them to make a great nation. And Jacob and his family are a part of that multiplication. So after many generations, this cultural mandate is being fulfilled, that they are being fruitful and multiplying, and they're filling Egypt up. But Pharaoh comes along, and Pharaoh interprets this differently. He doesn't say, oh, good, I'm so glad that they are fulfilling God's call to them. He sees this as a threat. We see in verse 8, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. We'll come back to that. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. See, Pharaoh's got a different perspective. Pharaoh has a different worldview. He has a different understanding of who he is and of the world around him. Pharaoh actually believes that he is God. He holds to that original lie from the garden, that rather than being like God, that he could actually become God. And so Pharaoh is just the outworking of that, the natural outworking of believing that we are to become God, a replacement for God. And Pharaoh is the embodiment of that. He believes that he is God and has no consideration for this God of the Israelites. So when he sees that the Israelite people are growing in number, he sees that as a threat. He's responding out of fear that they might somehow take his power and his position. And so his plan is to get rid of them or to make their lives as miserable as possible. So this idea of Pharaoh not knowing Joseph, it's not as if he really truly did not know who Joseph was. It has more to do with disregarding Joseph. Basically saying it's insignificant, it's not important. I don't care about this Joseph, and I don't care to give favor to his people. Yeah, sure, they saved us in a pinch when we were going through that famine, but what have they done for us lately is kind of his approach and his mentality. And all that he can see is that they are a threat. What if they side with our enemies and try to overthrow us? That would be terrible. So in this, Pharaoh decides, rather than to protect this people that are part of his kingdom, which is really his role as king, he decides to betray his role as king. He no longer is going to protect his people and provide for their flourishing. He's going to use them to his own advantage. He's going to put them into slavery and put them to work and create harsh conditions for them to experience. We see this in verses 12 through 14. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So Moses, the writer of Exodus, is setting the scene here. He's trying to give us an insight into the kind of conditions that the Israelites were experiencing. It says that they were dealt with shrewdly. They were not given grace and favor. They were afflicted from their heavy burdens. They were oppressed. They were dealt ruthlessly. Their lives were made bitter with hard labor. So, in essence, what we're seeing is that they're not being treated as they are intended to be treated, as God's people. In fact, Pharaoh's going to go a step further. He's going to try to eradicate them through a kind of genocide. We read about this in verses 15 through 22. Pharaoh tells the midwives essentially to not allow the sons of the Israelites to live. It says in verse 15, "Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, 'When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live.'" Now, the insight there is that Pharaoh was intending to use those daughters for his own purposes, whether servants in his household or possibly concubines, but he was going to put them to work and make their lives just as miserable. Many of them probably would have wished that they had died under Pharaoh's rule. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and let the male children live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live." It's interesting, as I've mentioned, there are 400 some years of silence where they are in slavery in Egypt, and God is relatively inconspicuous rather. He's not there. He's not active in a way that they can see, and yet these midwives maintain their faith in him and their fear of him. Their fear, and this idea of fear, is not the kind of fear that's driving Pharaoh to get rid of the Israelites. It's more of a fear out of reverence and awe, a respect for God and understanding of who God is. And that fear of the Lord leads to their faithfulness. They put faithfulness to God above fear of Pharaoh, because Pharaoh could have wiped them out. He could have removed them, killed them. He could have punished them. And yet, they're not afraid of what Pharaoh will do to them. They fear the Lord, and so they choose to be faithful to him. And that faithfulness in the midst of their suffering leads to favor from God. He's pleased with them, and he blesses them with their own families. So their response is a picture to us of what it looks like in the midst of suffering, in the midst of potential consequences for our decisions. How are we to live and respond? Well, we are to fear the Lord above all things and strive by his grace to be faithful in our circumstances. For them, faithfulness looked like disobedience to Pharaoh, not adhering to the kind of genocide that he was asking them to participate in. But in the midst of this, in the midst of our own suffering, you can imagine the kinds of questions that they were asking and that we too ask in our suffering. What we tend to do in the midst of our suffering is cry out to God. We ask questions like, "Where are you, God? Do you hear me?" So often we can't see God in the midst of our suffering. We're blinded by the pain that we experience. We don't know where God is. We don't know whether he hears us or not. We begin to believe that he is silent and that he is absent. And then we ask some really profound questions. Why is this happening? How long will this last? As we read through the Psalms, you see this refrain over and over again. The psalmist saying, "Why, O Lord, is this happening?" Or, "How long will this last?" And God does not always answer those questions. We don't always know why, and we certainly don't always know how long. The Israelites didn't know that. It had been over 400 years since God was active, and God was visibly active in their life, and all they were experiencing was harsh treatment. Why is this happening? How long is this going to last? For the first generation, those who knew Joseph or knew of Joseph's accomplishments, this would have been shocking to them. Wait a minute, what happened? We had favor from the Egyptians. We helped save them from this famine. But after generation after generation, eventually it would have gotten to the point where they would have known nothing different. This is what life is like. We are born into slavery. This is who I am. I am a slave. They would have wrestled with understanding this in light of God's story, because at this time, the passing on of God's story would have been through storytelling. It would have been an oral tradition. So they maintained this faith by telling the stories of God's creation and God's faithfulness, of the generations of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph as well. But as time would have passed, those stories would have become harder and harder for them to believe, to maintain that hope of God fulfilling his promises to them. And over time, they would have begun to doubt and question God's faithfulness. But it's interesting, when God calls Abram and makes a covenant with him, he actually tells him that this moment is going to come. In Genesis 15, God says to Abram, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years." So this, if they had known this story, this wouldn't have come as a surprise. They would have seen that they were the fulfillment of God's prophecy. That years from now, hundreds of years from now, generations from Abraham, this moment would come. And now here it is. But, God continues, "But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions." That's the promise that God makes to Abram and to these people who are in Egypt. He is going to judge Pharaoh for his treatment of God's people. And they're going to come out of Egypt no longer slaves, but wealthy with great possessions. So that gives us an insight into how the story is going to unfold in these coming weeks. We're going to see God judging Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And we're going to see God redeeming his people out of slavery. But there are still questions and doubts for them, this uncertainty about why God isn't acting now. Why isn't he doing something about my suffering? What's the point and purpose of this suffering? Why would God allow this to happen? Well, we don't have a definitive answer. Why would God choose to let this 400 years of slavery pass? Why would God choose and allow Pharaoh to treat his people this way? Well, Paul gives us some insight into the purpose of suffering, which is one of the hardest things for us to understand. What's the purpose of this suffering? What Paul says in Romans 5 is that suffering produces something. He goes as far as saying that we are to rejoice in our sufferings. And that's not to say that suffering in and of itself is good, but what God does in and through our suffering is not wasted. It's for our good. He says that suffering produces endurance. And this people had endured for over 400 years. They had endured this suffering. Some of you here today feel like it's been 400 years of suffering. Every day is a daily grind, is a experience of enduring through pain and suffering. I had just a small, and I mean very, very small insight into that this last week. I woke up on Tuesday morning and I couldn't move my neck. And that's never really happened to me. And it was a sharp pain. Clearly I had slept on it wrong. And the first thought I had was, I can't imagine waking up like this every single day. What it would be like to have chronic, ongoing pain, unexplainable pain that doctors couldn't fix or cure. I can't imagine what that would be like to experience that kind of physical suffering. So if you're here today and that's your story, know that God sees that and understands the daily experience of suffering, and that he's wanting to cultivate in you ability to endure that suffering. Certainly, we continue to pray that it would be alleviated and removed, but in the absence of that he would allow us, to help us to endure. Because Paul goes on and says that endurance produces character. When we endure our suffering, it shapes us into who God intends us to be. Now, sometimes our suffering shapes us into bitter, resentful, harsh, angry people. But what God desires to do is to shape us into faithful people who trust Him, honest people who cry out in our pain and suffering, fearful people who fear Him and not our circumstances, godly people who trust Him in the midst of our suffering. Paul goes on and says that character, that godly character, through suffering produces hope. And that's what we have to cling to in the midst of our suffering. Hope that does not put us to shame. That it's not shameful for us to hope that one day God will remove this suffering in whatever form we are experiencing it. That's the promise He made to the Israelites, is that He will address their suffering. He will bring judgments. He will redeem them, and He will make them a great nation once again. There's hope that they're clinging to. And sometimes for us, that hope is faint, and it's vague and it's abstract, but we cling to that hope that one day things will be the way they're supposed to be. Now, we hope that will happen here and now in this lifetime, but if not, we have the hope that in eternity, things will be as they're supposed to be. There will not be physical suffering. There will not be relational breakdown. There will not be fear. There will not be abuse. There will not be sadness, sickness, and death. Those things will be defeated and removed, and we will experience the hope of eternity. Paul goes on to say the reason for that hope is because of God's love, which He's poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who's been given to us. So what is God's answer to suffering? It is His love. His love poured out by His Spirit because of His Son. That's His response to suffering. That's the hope that we have, is that God sees our suffering and responds out of love for our suffering. He is a God of comfort and care. So even though He may allow us to suffer and to call us to endure our suffering, ultimately His love to our suffering has the final word. This is what Joseph is getting to when he speaks to his brothers. He's not saying that what his brothers did was good because good came from it. That's not what he's saying. What they did was wrong. And some of you here need to understand that the suffering you experience is wrong. When you experience suffering at the hands of another, it is not good suffering. It's not good for you to suffer. The suffering you're experiencing is wrong. It's not supposed to be that way. But what Joseph is able to see is God's perspective of his suffering, that God will not waste one bit of his suffering. He will not allow any of it to go to waste, but He will bring about good through suffering. Well, we see this for the Israelites, that God has been watching and waiting, and now He's going to act. We read in chapter 2, verse 23, during those many days, the king of Egypt died. So a new king is stepping in. The one who initially put the Israelites into slavery has died, and now a new king is going to continue that. And the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. It gives us a tremendous insight of what are we to do in the midst of suffering. We are to groan. We are to cry out for help. We are to cry out to God in the midst of our suffering. What He doesn't ask us to do is just grin and bear it. He's not saying endure it and just act like everything's okay. He's not asking us to plaster a permagrin on our face and just act like it's not a big deal. He's actually inviting us to cry out to Him, to ask for help, to allow our groans to be heard. Sometimes we suffer in ways that all we can do is grunt and groan. We can't even articulate what we're experiencing. And Romans 8 gives us a picture of those groans are interpreted and carried by the Holy Spirit Himself to God, who hears the groans and He understands our groaning. In verse 24 it says, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered His covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. See, God hears their groaning. Even though He has not acted during these 400 years, He is paying attention. He's watching closely. In fact, He has a better perspective of their suffering than they do. And the same is true for us as well. Those of you who are suffering and wondering, where is God? Does he see this? Is he listening to this? You can take hope in knowing he's paying attention. He knows you're suffering intimately. He's watching closely. He grieves and groans with you. And it says here that God remembered his covenant. This idea of remembering someone or a covenant with someone is not because God has forgotten. It's not like he was like, oh yeah, that completely slipped my mind. I just had so many other things to do. It's not that kind of forgetting that he's remembering. It indicates that he's about to take action for that person's welfare. His remembrance is a call to action. He is now going to act. We don't know why he's waited till now, but what we do know is he's going to act. And he's going to act definitively and clearly and explicitly. And that's how the next several chapters of the Exodus story will unfold, is seeing God act on behalf of the Israelites. He's going to do for them that which they cannot do for themselves. There's no way out of slavery for them, and God's going to make a way because he's going to act, because he's made a promise to them. And when God makes a promise to his people, there's a guarantee that he will fulfill his promise. This verse ends with God seeing his people and God knowing. God knew, which is more than just a mere awareness of their situation. It conveys a deep, personal, intimate knowledge and pity and empathy for his people. He knows what they're experiencing. And through Jesus, he knows it intimately. He sends his own son to experience the kind of suffering that we experience. He knows what it's like for us to suffer because his own son has suffered as we have suffered. He knows our suffering up close and personal. So we can take hope in knowing that God hears our groaning. Something I want you to consider as we respond in worship is that you would take this time. We sing praise to God, but we also can cry out to him in grief and lament. We can groan before our Father, and he hears our groaning. So if you're here today and you are experiencing suffering, this is a place and a time for you to groan, for you to cry out, for you to honestly speak to God about the suffering that you're experiencing. There's no suffering that he sees as trivial or unimportant, or no suffering that he sees as insurmountable. He welcomes all of our suffering and the groaning that comes with it. God remembers his promise to us, which he has fulfilled through Jesus, and is in the process of fulfilling through his plan for restoration. It's not fulfilled yet, but he is progressively fulfilling his plan. And God knows our suffering personally and intimately. So intimately that he invites us to eat at his table, where he offers us bread, which represents his own son's body broken for us. He offers us wine or juice, which represents his own son's blood shed for us. This is his answer to our sin and our suffering. Come, all who are weary, and I will give you rest. Come, all who are broken because of sin, and I will give you righteousness. Come and eat and drink, and be reminded of the hope we have in Jesus. Let's pray. Father God, we come to you today weak and weary. While we're not enslaved as your people were, we are enslaved to many other things. We have volunteered for slavery in the things that we have trusted other than you. Or we might be experiencing conditions that feel like slavery, like we have no way out and no control. We feel helpless and hopeless, if we're honest. And so we come to you today to cry out to you in our groaning. We trust that you will hear our cries for help, that you will listen, that you will respond, and that you will act on our behalf. Help us to worship you today through our cries, through our praise, through our tears, through our joy. Give us what we lack. Give us hope. Give us faith because of your love. We ask in your name. Amen.